Chapter 9. At the moment the massacre was taking place at the warehouse, Detectives Ryan and Benson were standing on the lot where the charred remains of the OEO office lay. The FBI agents, still on the scene, rummaging through the debris, had made a find. They had called Lieutenant Stein and informed him of their discovery. A small strongbox embedded in the wall containing a file. Stein had come down to the house alone without notifying Benson and Ryan. Agent Comstock, the black man who had met with Ryan and Benson that first day, had spoken with Stein as two of his men attempted to pry open the small strongbox. The problem was that the metal was so twisted from the heat that the normal method of prying was impossible. In order not to destroy the contents of the box, the agents virtually had to chip away at the metal piece by piece. As Stein watched the operation with Comstock and his brow furrowed, Comstock noticed this and asked the lieutenant if anything was wrong. The white officer shrugged his shoulders and shook his head.
"Where's those two cops from Detroit?"
Comstock asked Stein.
"Out on a lead, I think,"
Stein replied, looking quickly at the black agent.
"They were staying at the Biltmore, weren't they?"
Comstock asked.
"Uh-huh,"
Stein replied, staring intently at the men who were attempting to open the box. Comstock watched the big lieutenant carefully. He had disliked the man since the day he had been brought into the case. There was something unprofessional about him, something that did not jibe with a police officer. And now, when the possibility of a clue was present, he had not bothered to contact the two detectives. To Comstock, this kind of lapse was intolerable and inexcusable.
"Listen, man,"
Comstock said after a few minutes of silence.
"I'm going over to the cafe for some coffee. You stay nearby and keep an eye on things, all right?" "Sure, Comstock,"
Stein agreed immediately. Comstock left the scene, jogging across the street and around the corner to the small cafe. Inside, he went directly to the phone booth and got the number of the Biltmore Hotel from the information operator. Benson answered the phone and listened as Comstock explained what was going on at the site. After hanging up the phone, the black FBI agent began to sense that what he was feeling was correct. There was something about Stein that he did not like. Detectives Benson and Ryan arrived at the site 10 minutes after Comstock's call. They lied to Lieutenant Stein, telling him that they had checked in with headquarters and discovered the call that Comstock had made an hour before.
"I had Sergeant Collins ring you guys at the hotel,"
Stein complained.
"But he wasn't able to get in touch."
Benson nodded.
"Yeah, well, can never tell about those desk boys. Their heads are always somewhere else."
The two detectives stood for a moment looking into the burnt frame of the house. Comstock ran up to them the moment he saw them, and the two black men confronted each other directly.
"Glad you're here, gentlemen,"
Comstock said.
"We're about ready to break it open. Don't have any idea what's inside, but it might help."
Benson nodded to the agent.
"Thanks. Sure it's worth a short ride anyway."
The three men walked through the debris and toward the rear of the burnt house. There, two agents were kneeling over a small metal strongbox. One man held the box while the other jammed a screwdriver into the small opening between the lid and the case. With a grunt, the agent pulled on the screwdriver, and the top of the box snapped open.
"Finally,"
Comstock said.
"We've been hacking this thing for over an hour. Didn't want to destroy anything inside."
The three men knelt down around the small box. Comstock pulled out a pair of tweezers from his coat pocket and began lifting the pieces of paper from inside the box. After about 20 sheets, he came to a small packet with the name of a photography laboratory on the outside. He lifted this out of the box and laid it on the ground next to the sheets of paper. Detective Benson read each typewritten page carefully, passing it on to Ryan when he finished. Then, after reading all of the written contents, he had Comstock pull out the photos from the packet. The agent spread the pictures on the ground in a small circle around the papers. The three men sat on their haunches and looked at the photos.
"Ish," Benson said. "I think we just solved it."
"Looks that way,"
Comstock said.
"Wilbur Seamus."
Ryan pronounced the name again, then continued,
"This is what Stone and the office were doing."
Benson chuckled.
"Exactly. Kenyatta's whole thing. Break down the pushers, the large rings, bringing smack into the ghettos. He must have been about ready to hit Seamus, and Seamus knew it."
"I got one thing to say for this Kenyatta,"
Comstock said.
"He certainly is thorough. He's got enough of this guy to put him away for life."
Suddenly, one of the typewritten sheets of paper caught Benson's attention. He picked up the paper and read it out loud.
"We know that there is a contact within the Los Angeles Police Department. An officer. Seamus's street pushers, even though picked up, never spent more than 1 hour or 2 in jail. Never prosecuted, and all charges dropped."
The three men looked at each other.
"Can you beat that?"
Comstock said.
"There's more,"
Benson said, reading on.
"He talks about a white man, a certain connection from outside the city. Then he says the operation must be huge, with inroads into organized crime."
Jesus. The three men stood and stared down at the evidence on the ground at their feet.
"Cannot believe this,"
Comstock said slowly.
"We got ourselves onto something really big here."
"Yeah," Benson agreed. "But so has Kenyatta, and he's still one step ahead of us." At that moment, Lieutenant Stein joined the group of men. For some reason, they all stopped talking and began picking up the contents of the strongbox.
"Find anything?"
Stein asked.
"Not much,"
Comstock replied.
"Just a bunch of junk. You know, personal papers, stuff like that."
Benson watched Stein closely. The white officer was vague and seemingly uninterested in the matter that any officer worth his badge should have been.
"You want to take a look?"
Benson asked the lieutenant.
"Yeah, sure, okay,"
Stein replied. They watched as Stein leafed through the contents of the strongbox. Finally, he put the papers down. Beads of perspiration had formed on the man's pink forehead. His body seemed to be breaking out in a strong sweat.
"Looks good,"
he mumbled. Ryan nodded.
"Sure as hell does, Stein."
Suddenly, the lieutenant turned on his heels, said something about making a report back at headquarters, and walked quickly towards his car. Comstock, Benson, and Ryan watched him as he jumped into his unmarked car and sped off.
"What do you think?"
Benson asked.
"I think,"
Comstock said slowly,
"that we got ourselves a real case."
The conversation was disrupted by an excited uniformed officer who ran across to the burnt house, shouting to the officer that a full-scale massacre had taken place only 3 miles away. Before leaving the site, Benson quickly packed a strongbox and held it close to his body as he ran toward his car to join Ryan. Neighborhood children had gathered behind and in front of the abandoned warehouse. The little black kids dressed in torn and tattered clothes, and some of the older boys wearing colorful beanies, milled around the squad cars and ambulances. They were silent as they looked down upon the mangled bodies. Blood was everywhere, still seeping from the dead men. Ryan, Benson, and Comstock pulled up to the site and were signaled through by the uniformed officer. The entire block had been sealed off by the police. News crews with their cameras humming were at that moment still trying to break through. They came upon the Plymouth still sitting in the middle of the street with the two dead men in the front seat. Their already rotting bodies were covered with flies and the stench of death.
Has anyone run a make on the license number yet?
Benson asked a uniformed policeman standing next to the car.
Yes, we're still waiting,
he answered. Ryan walked to the front of the car and noticed a dent on the right fender and the black paint that must have come from the other car. He called Comstock over and asked if their men could run a lab check on the paint. Comstock jotted down the request in a small black book. Sergeant Harry Clemens, a thin white man with a huge mustache and very little hair, approached Benson and Ryan.
You guys, Benson and Ryan from Detroit?
Clemens asked gruffly.
That's right,
Benson answered, staring into the officer's clear, cold blue eyes.
I called you both. We got a witness in the alley, an old wino who fits the description of the black you're looking for.
Now, Willie,
Clemens began, addressing the old man slowly and kindly.
Tell these two men here what you saw this morning.
Willie swung his feet over the edge of the platform and looked to Benson.
Got a cigarette, man?
He asked in a hoarse, wine-soaked voice.
Sure, man,
Benson said, pulling out a Pall Mall and handing it to the wino. Willie shook as he placed the cigarette between his lips and used both hands to keep the cigarette steady while Benson lit it for him.
Now, Willie, my man,
Benson began, dropping his voice into street slang.
Tell us what you saw. It's very important.
Willie drew heavily on his cigarette, then spoke.
Well, I was sleeping behind them trash cans. I hear a car pull up and stop, you know. Couple of dudes get out.
What color were they, Willie? Benson interrupted.
Jeez, man. What other color come down here but black? Those men were n***s, man.
Willie seemed to glare at the black detective as though the man was incapable of understanding something that was very simple.
Now,
Benson began.
Could you describe the man?
Sure, man,
Willie replied.
He was the biggest f***ing I've ever seen. I mean, huge. And he was bald. Completely bald. He was mean, man. Really mean.
Benson and Ryan exchanged glances.
Let's get Miller over here, Ryan,
Benson said.
Sergeant,
Ryan began, turning to Clemens.
Could you keep the bodies here for, say, 10 minutes? No, he can't.
All three men turned quickly and faced Lieutenant Stein. The large man was standing with his back to the sun. His face was completely shadowed.
Let's clear this area, Clemens, and get this f***ing investigation underway.
The man's voice was shaking. Benson heard the fear and the horror in it. He wondered if Stein was that inexperienced or if he was getting old. Clemens shook his head at Ryan.
We'll take them all down to the morgue. I'll wait there till you bring your man. Thanks, Clemens,
Ryan said. Ryan called Miller, and the contact agreed to meet the detectives at the county morgue. When Ryan returned to Benson, the two men began walking through the warehouse looking for something that might truly link Kenyatta with the massacre. But all they found was the ever-present shadow of Lieutenant Stein, who followed them step for step. Johnny Miller arrived at the county coroner's office a half hour after Ryan had made the call. The thin black man was dressed up as usual, but his mannerisms were shaky and nervous. Benson and Ryan greeted him outside the morgue itself.
"What's up?"
Miller asked, trying to sound light.
"It's these dead men, Johnny. We figured you might be able to identify a few,"
Benson replied.
"Oh man, what a drag."
Miller followed the two detectives into the morgue room, where they were greeted by a small white man wearing a smock. In the corner of the room, Lieutenant Stein leaned against the wall, watching the trio very carefully. The attendant pulled out the 6 drawers with the sheet-covered bodies lying side by side on slabs. Benson and Ryan stood behind Miller as he walked along the row, looking down at each face. Finally, he came to the end and turned to Benson.
"Wilbert Seamus. They're his dudes."
"You sure of that?"
Benson asked.
"No doubt, man. Those cats had it wired down there in Watts. Seen them all over the fucking place."
Benson smiled to himself. With the discovery of the strongbox and now the massacre, the operation was coming together. The links between Seamus and Kenyatta were being made. The only problem now was to find out why it had happened, why the men had clashed at the warehouse.
"Johnny,"
Benson began after a moment,
who laid it down to you about the big shipment?"
Miller frowned, then turned his back to the corpses lying on the slabs.
"Man, I don't know."
"Listen, Johnny, we got to know,"
Benson urged.
"Okay, but let me out of this hish. I'll tell you the dude's name, and you forget it. You dig where I'm coming from? I mean, too many dudes been dying around here."
"All right, Miller, tell us the name and we'll call it even."
Miller looked from Benson to Ryan, and then quickly at Stein.
"His name's Horning. Small fat dude. Haven't seen him since that night he laid down that shit to me."
The name did not ring a bell. Neither man had heard it before. When Benson turned to ask Stein if he had ever heard the name, he discovered the lieutenant had left the room.
"Shit, man,"
Miller said quickly.
"Get me a fucking ticket out of this town. There's some real heavy shit going down. Real heavy."
Benson looked quickly at Ryan, and the two men communicated in silence. Finally, Ryan fished out a $100 bill and put it into Miller's hand. He told the man to be careful and led him to the door. After Miller had gone, he returned to Benson.
"Where did Stein go?"
Ryan asked.
"Damned if I know, but I'll tell you one thing. This thing is big. Bigger than anything Kenyatta's gotten himself into before."
"No doubt, Ben,"
Ryan replied.
"But where do we go now?"
Benson led the way out of the sterile room, thanked the attendant, then turned to Ryan after they were outside in the hallway.
"We got to find Horning. He's our main man right now. We'll call Comstock and see if the feds have anything on him, all right?"
Ryan nodded.
"Yeah, but I have a feeling we better move fast. This thing looks like it's gonna blow."
"Man,"
Benson chuckled sardonically.
"with Kenyatta, the fuse is always lit."